What is up, everybody? This is Marshall Lee of Donkey Jaw Projects. Once again, if you were paying attention, you would see that I already started this video, but I had to close it down because of technical difficulties. So we're back. We have Mr. Doug Garrett and Muttman here on the show, hanging out. We're going to probably have some other guests coming on too. And we're going to be talking about better comic stories, better stories in comics, actually. But first, we got a few cool things to share. Right now, I'm working, as you've seen in my working artist vlogs, I've been working on the Lone Wolf comic book. It's the Legends of the Lone Wolf. It's an anthology, much like the anthology that I did called Werewolves and Unicorns recently. That's also going to be going up soon as a crowdfunding thing. But right now we're talking about Lone Wolf, and it's really going good. I'm enjoying the process of illustrating what Doug has written for our part in the anthology. And again, yeah, Doug's here to talk about that and other things as well. So how you doing, Doug?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. And once again, the link is in the description if you want to check out Legends of the Lone Wolf. Is that how it goes? Legends of the Lone Wolf, right?
yeah, that's it.
And I'm really looking forward to it. There's just a lot of cool art on there. The cover's like amazing. And just some really cool creators making some interesting stories with the lore of the whole Lone Wolf thing. And then we got Muttman here, who's also got an Indiegogo going. He's doing Hero with Macho Dan, and I'm really excited to read that. It seems really cool. And yeah, how you doing, man? Tell him a little bit about that.
I'm doing fantastic. We are about 83% funded at this point for Hero, and we are closing in on that 100% funded goal pretty quickly. We've got a lot of great fans that have come out of the woodwork and to support us, and it's just been amazing. And it's really been enjoyable just to see the energy that people have toward our project. I mean, we're brand new. We have zero name out there for ourselves. We're just a couple of indie guys that this is our first book. So getting any kind of energy back toward it is really rewarding, and we're getting a lot. So it's actually a complete blast to do this.
That's awesome. And there's also like art contests you guys are doing for people who do hero art. So that's really cool. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Macho put it out yesterday. This is his baby. He just wanted to see what folks could do. And so he put out the art challenge, and it's not just necessarily for illustrators or digital illustrators. It's for anybody. He says, make a sculpture. You could do Play-Doh, you could do paper mache, you can do macaroni, whatever you want to do. Just make something for Hero, and it'll get in the contest, and we'll have a live stream, and we'll narrow it down, and then we'll just have some kind of a democratic process where we get to pick the winner.
Where you pick me, because I'm going to submit like 4 or 5 things to this.
Yeah, I definitely want to put something in there. That's a really cool idea for a campaign kind of thing to keep people excited, I think. And again, the link for both Lone Wolf and Hero are in the description if you guys want to go check that out. Actually, I'll be honest, they are not in the description yet, but they will be very shortly. And so you can check out, but if you go to Indiegogo and type in Hero spelled Hiro, you'll be able to find that. And if you type in Legends of the Lone Wolf, you'll be able to find that on Indiegogo as well. And we also have another guest here, Mr. Michael Emmerich. What's going on, dude?
Hey, what's up, dude? What's up, everybody?
Hey, Michael.
Hey.
How you doing?
Oh, pretty good, man. Tired. I'm not normally up this early.
Yes, you're making it for the Early Bird Artcast.
Right.
We're going as late as we can possibly go, and you're here.
Well, I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, man. I'm always happy to have you on. It's been a while since I've been able to chat with you live, so that's really cool.
Yeah, it is.
And speaking of anthologies, Mr. Mike Emmerich is knee deep right now in putting together the Werewolves and Unicorns anthology. We all did our work. We did our comic stories, and now he's got to deal with the hard part. So how's that going, man?
Oh, it's going great, man. The hard part's actually done. We're just we're figuring out the budget right now and just kind of finalizing stuff, figuring out what we can afford, what we can't afford, and just exactly how it's all going to play out, So otherwise, book is done, man. I'm so excited about that. Like, it is ready to print. We can't get our proof copy though, like we got last time. We went through Kablam last time, and they let you order just one book, which is nice because you can kind of pre-plan and like figure things out before the Kickstarter. But we're going through Comics Wellspring this time, and they make you have to put in the order first, and then you can get the proof. So I'm thinking of some sneaky ways to get around it. I might actually order a proof from Kablam just to get some of the initial stuff out of the way. Like a little like, is the text aligned right? Is everything going to fall within the safety well enough and things like that, so that I don't have like as much corrections to do later. We could just get the proof from Comics Wellspring, and hopefully it's just good and we can go. But yeah, man, other than that, it's pretty much done. We're just tying up the loose ends right now. Super stoked, man. It's going to be a good book.
I can't wait till we can release the cover. I hope we're going to be able to release that soon, because Scott Circlin did an amazing job on that.
Yeah. Well, what we were thinking was like, we have to decide on the exact launch date right now. We had some kind of hiccups in the planning, so I'm glad we didn't start releasing it just yet. But we're going to go like a week, like the week before launch. We're just going to like hammer social media with all kinds of stuff leading up to it, kind of build up some hype like we did last time. That seemed to work pretty well, actually. And Scott was talking about revealing like little bits all the way up to the launch until we finally released the cover on the Kickstarter page. So
that's cool. Yeah, it's a really cool cover. And I think it's cool that the only thing I will say, and that's spoiling it, but I really think, because he's already talked about this before,
sure.
But I think it's really cool that he's maintaining kind of that kind of retro feel. Like there's a little bit of a retro vibe going on, with the cover for the Life in Space anthology, and now also with this one. So that's really cool.
Yeah, we got one little thing that we're gonna do that's kind of in line with that retro feel too, that I think people are gonna dig as well. We got some of the creators in on it too. We're in cahoots. We're up to some shenanigans.
Awesome. So we are all involved in making lots of comic book stories and comic book storytelling, writing, art, all different things. And I'm just curious, I guess, to kind of get into this topic, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so bear with me. But I've basically growing up being, into comics most of my life. I've always enjoyed comics like a lot, but I've also always been wanting more out of my comics when it comes to the stories. I've just always felt like, that I didn't quite get the same kind of impact out of comic stories that I do out of watching some movies and some, reading some novels and things like that. And, I want to have those kind of those impacts, the kind of emotional things. I mean, I think all of us have, I know that all of us have gone to see Avengers Endgame recently. No spoiler. But, I think, I don't know Mike's opinion yet, but I think most people can agree that coming out of that movie was a pretty emotional experience, even if you're like a hardcore dude and stuff.
Man, everybody I talked to shed at least one tear at some point about something.
So, I mean, that's a story about some comics that I love, but I don't necessarily get that same reaction when I'm, reading one of those comics. I don't know. Have you guys ever, especially in the superhero genre, have you guys ever had that kind of experience, with maybe a superhero comic or?
not anything modern. There's some.
Mm.
I can't point anything out off the top of my head, but if I still own it, then at some point it's touched me somehow.
Mhm.
Because usually, if a book doesn't do anything for me, I don't keep it.
Right.
But you know, it seems like modern books are kind of lacking this great storytelling that really pulls you in like a movie does. The comic should do the same thing, that the movie does.
Yeah, and I think that's always been my thing too, is I feel like there's no reason why comics can't do that, because comics have so much going for it that it has stuff going for it that movies don't even have going for it, sometimes. So I know it can happen. I just want to see it. I want to experience it,
I think I've definitely experienced it with some, but I agree with what you just said. Not a whole lot of new stuff. I think of like Watchmen had a big impact on me. I know people have different opinions about it. I really liked it. I wouldn't say like crying or anything like that, like not intensely emotional, but definitely felt for the characters and, really felt some impact from the twists and turns.
Mhm.
Another one, a lesser known title that I just recently read that's back from the 90s. It's a Kenneth Rocafort book, Madame Mirage. That actually had a pretty good impact on me. I don't want to spoil anything because if you haven't read it, you should. It's really awesome. It's in the spy femme fatale kind of genre, but the twist was emotional. It was pretty emotional. Really dug that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a few, but I think when you're watching a film, it's playing on a lot more of your senses and music and audio and stuff like that has a big impact on how we feel about stuff. I think like especially sound effects and just how they portray like a tremor in someone's voice, or you can see tears welling up in someone's eyes. We're more emotionally attached to stuff like that. When it's in like a graphic form, I feel like it's a little harder for us to connect on that visceral kind of level because not many people are looking to or are prone to even like feeling that kind of emotional response from stories in general. Like we watch tons of movies and TV shows and it's not like, we feel like they're real people or anything. But there's like, I don't know. Is that making any sense? I feel like I went off the rails there.
No, not at all. Yeah, that makes total sense. And that's one thing you can say too is, I'm not saying that, you know, like it does. It's not like it happens in every TV show and every movie either.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, like it is only the better ones sometimes. Or I mean, not every TV show is trying to get you into that place either. So I shouldn't say better, but it's only certain ones that really kind of do that. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes comics are missing opportunities that they actually could get to. I think that comics could be powerful in that way, and obviously there are, you brought up like Watchmen, and there are obviously comics out there that have done some pretty good, kind of caused some. I feel like I'm going towards emotional responses, but that's not necessarily all the only thing about it. Like it's also like sometimes a comic or a story having like a profound impact on you, where it's just like even like The Matrix kind of did that for me when I first watched it. It's like, those kind of concepts have been around in science fiction forever, but like the way they presented it, it was like, oh, I get it, and that is some crazy deep stuff right there. Like, now I really get it. Like, so I don't know. It's like I want to have that kind of.
Yeah.
I want to have that impact with my stories, when it comes to comics and stuff,
It seems like what you're saying, what you're getting at is that comics can be more,
Yes.
There's more dimensions, especially emotional dimensions that people can get to with comics.
Hmm.
And I agree with that. And actually, I've kind of been on this a little bit of a soapbox lately. People are probably getting tired of hearing people that listen to me are probably getting tired of me talking about it because it's a little bit, pie in the sky. But my thing is like comics are the greatest medium. So when you're talking about telling stories, people a lot of times will kind of talk about comics in a lesser than way. But in my opinion, comics are they're the top number one best way to tell a story because of the, just basically this ageless use of words and pictures and sequential.
Mm-hmm.
So when I when I start talking about this, inevitably it comes up that people a lot of times, especially modern comics, will try to kind of create a comic book, which is a vehicle for something else, almost like, you know what I mean? Like the comic book is just the stepping stone. They're creating a comic so that they can make a movie or a show or a game. And, that's one way to do it. And for some people that's definitely worked. But for me, the comic is the destination. Like that's it. You make a comic, that's your greatest platform for a story. It can be anything. And I really believe that like the emotional power that you get in movies, it's all about the way that you try to put that same level of storytelling and art into the comic. And you can reach that. It's achievable. For me, like there were some really emotional connections to some of the great ones. Like, The Dark Knight was one of those that I'll never forget. The first time I read through it, when I put it down after I had just poured over it for a day, I felt this real high and this real connection to that story.
Yeah.
It was done at a very high level and done with this sort of excellence in storytelling, probably Frank Miller's, greatest work. And it left a huge mark on me, because of that. So I believe it's possible for comics not only to be more, but to be the greatest form of storytelling that people will gravitate to.
Yeah, you get the visual part, but you also get to see into the characters. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite storylines, favorite everything, is Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. He took Swamp Thing to a whole nother level, and you get to see this existential journey where he completely redefines what this character's humanity. And it's mind-blowing. I mean, he's not fighting monsters or anything, but it's just this whole journey. And when I read that, it blew my mind. That has forever became one of my favorite stories, just because I never thought about a comic book really going there and telling that type of story.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Comics can tell stories that TV and movies can't, and traditionally they kind of always have. They've been able to delve into subjects that those kind of producers don't want to go near because they have to keep, to a certain script or a certain ideology or whatever. Whereas comics have sort of, for the most part, always been free to tackle issues that you can't experience anywhere else. I love that about comics.
Yeah, especially indie comics where they're creator owned, and you can just basically do whatever you want without any kind of corporate masters to tell you what you can't do.
Yeah. Once upon a time, you could count on Marvel and DC for that kind of stuff, but not so much anymore. They've gotten really big.
Right. The example that I use when I refer to movie limitations, because movies as amazing as the Endgame was. Visually, just this epic movie, 3 hours of just, mind-bending visuals, which was amazing. But still, they can't reach the level that Jack Kirby reached, in the 60s and the 70s. And for me, like, the greatest example, the way that I point this out, is they still haven't made a good Fantastic Four movie.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, well, in my opinion, they haven't made a good Fantastic Four movie. And my reasoning for that is because they still can't match the emotional connection of the family that came off the page. And they can't match the scale of the universe that was created within that comic. There's just not enough budget. There's not enough time. There's not enough artists and people to do that. So for me, that's a good way to show that comics are still the number one storytelling medium.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And yeah, you guys bring up, Frank Miller and stuff, which I'll be honest, if there's any comic that I have kind of felt gotten some of that kind of impact that I get from some other mediums, it's been Frank Miller works. Sin City had a big impact on me. And, the Dark Knight, I actually, I read it like I don't know 5 years ago for the first time, and I was never like on that train of thought that everybody kind of got into, which, getting everything kind of going dark, and it's interesting, but it's not that interesting to me. So it was good, and I get when I read it, I'm like, I get why people like this,
Well,
I
think
this wasn't quite my thing. Go ahead.
I think with that one, you've got to look at it in the context of when it came out, and what Batman was at the time.
Yeah.
It's taking Batman from that 60s, 70s era where it wasn't so bad. This was like reimagining, the whole Dark Knight in the 80s. But when you talk about Frank Miller, I think one of his greatest, besides the Dark Knight, there is his run on Daredevil.
Oh yeah.
I haven't read that yet, but it's one I really want to read. I've heard.
I only got to get into it like a while back. It was on Comixology or something. And I was like, I've always wanted to read this. And I didn't realize it was that good.
Yeah. It made me a Daredevil fan, actually, because I'd heard people talking about it. And I was never really, I knew Daredevil from like his appearances in Spider-Man and stuff like that, but never really got into that character by himself. And I read Frank Miller's Born Again. Oh, man.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Awesome. It was so good. And that actually hit some chords, like some emotional chords. I mean, I wasn't crying for him or anything like that, but you felt for that character and you felt the struggle that he was going through. And yeah, that was some of the best comics I've ever read.
That's awesome. Have you guys ever read what is it, Superman? The one, I think it was Alan Moore, and it's supposed to be really good. It's the one where he's like dying of or something.
Oh yeah, I can't remember the name of that. It's like Whatever Happened to the Man of Steel or something like that.
Yeah, that I've read it, but I can't remember. It's been a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm not a big
Superman All-Star or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Superman All-Star was great.
That one's Grant Morrison, isn't it?
Yeah,
Grant Morrison. Yeah,
and Frank quietly does the artwork. It's just amazing.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's really good. But guys, I'm gonna have to jump.
Yep.
But I appreciate you having me on, and what little conversation I've got to join in. This has been a really good conversation.
Awesome.
Absolutely, man.
Good to meet you, man.
Yeah, you guys have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.
You too.
All right, later.
All right. So that was Doug signing off again. I'll be promoting Lone Wolf forever here, so you guys know what that's all about. So, yeah, man. That Superman All-Star, I keep hearing, like, really want to read that, because from what I hear, that's like Superman being told like Superman is supposed to be told, basically. And I don't know, I heard it's just a really great story.
Those all-star stories and like what if kind of stories can be some of the best. I've really enjoyed a lot of that kind of stuff. There was one, the Batman All-Star especially. They do some crazy stuff in that. One I read recently that a lot of people hate, but I absolutely love it. And it's actually kind of another great example of something that you can't get outside of comics, because there's no way they would do anything like this with Batman in the mainstream. But it's another Frank Miller. It's Frank Miller and Jim Lee teaming up, All-Star Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder.
Yeah.
It's so insane. It's like this battle-torn Batman, like just ripping Dick Grayson out of his world and throwing him into his little war. It is so nuts. It's really entertaining. A lot of people hated it, though. They thought it was too over the top. I loved it for how over the top it was.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I loved the All-Star suit. I did not care for the All-Star Batman and Robin, but I did like the Superman, and I don't like Superman. I'm not a fan of Superman because it's just one of those characters where I just think the scope of it is just too big and infinite. He's too godlike, and therefore just not as interesting to me. I like the characters that have very clear vulnerability, and have to sort of be a little bit more, careful. But anyway, but what I liked about Grant Morrison's run on that All-Star, and especially Frank Quietly's art, is that it really paints Superman in this universe. Like he's, you know, sort of outside the scope of they make sure that you understand he's outside the scope of humanity. And they put him in the context of humanity in very silly ways, like everyday ways, which are very funny. But then they also put him in these situations where, you know, he's in different universes doing different things. And they kind of make him more vulnerable that way, which I thought was pretty interesting. So that's why I liked it, because they kind of brought the vulnerability back to Superman.
Huh. That sounds cool. I might have to check that out. I'm kind of on the same page as you, where I never really got into him because I didn't dig the whole infinite power thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really care for anything like that. I never really got into Dragon Ball Z or anything about people with this intense power. It just didn't really.
Yeah, if you can like literally destroy a planet, then you know it's just not. It's like the Sentry, Marvel's the Sentry. I'm not interested in that either. You know, that kind of stuff. But my kid, it's like that's why I think Superman is better for kids. And I liked Superman as a kid. And like when I'm playing superheroes with my own boys, they always say, I want all the powers, you know. And they want basically to be able to do anything and have infinite ability. And no matter what happens while you're playing, there's no chance of them actually getting hurt or dying, because they'll just come up with a brand new power that they have.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And that's why Superman's not interesting.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know what it is about Superman. Like, and I know what you guys mean. I kind of grew up on Superman because my dad always shared his old Superman comics and stuff. And I like the real Superman, like, you know, the kind of the good Superman, like, and all that, you know, not like the kind of trying to be Dark Knight style Superman or something. But, you know, I get what you mean, because even when I was a kid, I remember I was like, I was hoping my dad had also some, you know, some Batman comics, but he didn't really have much of that. I'm not sure why, but I remember thinking, oh man, I wish he had some Batman ones. But I think I was just curious. But anyways, so as far as like all this stuff with better stories and all that, I wonder, like, what do you think is like maybe the strengths of comics, and how do you think like we can kind of write better stories or make better stories that you know, kind of hit that impact better, you know, than what you typically have seen in a lot of comics, either growing up or even now, you know?
That's a really good question, man. And I don't know if any of us can answer it definitively, but I think one of the biggest strengths comic has for sure is control of time. We can do so much with time that no other medium can do. I mean, a great example of that, I can't remember the issue number, but there was an issue of Flash where he was kind of going back and forth in time, and they had this like small little track of images with every last little thing that he was doing, while the bigger panels were like the effects of what was playing out and stuff like that. I've never seen done in film. I can't even conceive of a way that they could do it in that same way, where you can get so granular about time. There's also been comics that have been made. I think, again, this is another Flash one, although I might be thinking of a different character, but where time went forward up to the middle of the book and then backward from the middle to the end, and you could read it any way that you wanted and still get the same story. You can't do that with a movie at all. I mean, they've tried to do some things like your choose your own adventure type stuff, but it's just gimmicky. But a comic, you can experience something like that and actually not feel that it's gimmicky, actually feel like, wow, what a great use of the medium, you know? So yeah, time, I think, being one of the main factors, and also composition. You know, TV and movies, they're restricted to that little rectangle, widescreen rectangle, and they're kind of bound by an industry standard too. Like, you don't see many people making movies or television shows in a square format anymore. You know, but there were people that were able to do some interesting things with that too. So, you know, but those storytelling tools are obsolete now because, you know, they have to change with the times. Whereas comics, I mean, you do whatever you want. Todd McFarlane did a comic sideways just because he wanted to see how it would go, you know.
I love that.
Control over that.
Yeah, no, I think it's I think timing's a good point. Like where comics probably has an advantage again over movies is the ability to tell a long form story. You know, you can tell a story over 12 issues. You can tell a story in a 300-page paperback. So you sort of got more space and time to tell it, and you can, as you're telling it, you can gain more and more emotional ground as people get to know, because it's all about getting to know who you're talking about, right? So like if Hero is my main character, if I want people to care about Hero, then they need to know as much as I can fit in about this character. I have to sort of build the character from the ground up, and I have to reference real things, real people, real situations, and I have to intentionally go after some heartstrings. And that's something I think we can do with this character. I mean, there's a lot of fun in blowing stuff up and, knocking people out and doing brutal deaths and all that kind of stuff. That stuff's fun to tell. But if you want that stuff to have impact in the long run, you've got to make your characters interesting, number one. But by interesting, I mean that people connect to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's interesting. That the format of what we typically see comics do, which is these long form stories, is helpful. It's interesting though too. I wonder when it really started being like that, because earlier comics, and I feel like even early Marvel, like how often were there continued stories? For the most part, it seemed like most comics were one shots for a long time, and even a lot of comics, maybe before the big Marvel boom, most comics had like 2 or 3 stories in them, and still only had 30 or so pages. So it's interesting, and then like growing up though, reading some comics that okay, this is each comic is a part of a bigger story. I felt like I was getting too small of a slice of a story, where I was like kind of frustrated with that. That's something that I actually don't love about comics sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was big in the 90s too. Those really long extended story arcs or little mini story arcs in between story arcs and stuff that can that can push a lot of people away, I think, because they don't know how to get in. But I think an advantage we have now is more publishers are shooting for trade paperbacks. The floppies are for the diehards that want to read it right away. But you want to get someone into comics, you give them a good trade with a good story arc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the floppies are. Yeah, I agree. They're going away, and people are going to start to get that sort of like the quick comic book stories. I think that's the people that really love that are probably going to go online, or they're just going to kind of fade away. And eventually it'll be all trade paperbacks, all pretty much long form stories.
I think that'll be better for the medium too, actually. I think people, it's possible that people can make more money that way as well, because you're not forcing people to work these crazy hours to push out an issue a month, and you can take your time to really refine something that's going to have that impact, just like with an author of a novel or something like that. They work for years on a single book. So I think we might start seeing a lot more of that, and I think it might be a good thing.
Well, I agree, especially creatively. I mean, if you're focused on hitting a monthly deadline, it's definitely going to cause a lot of strain on what you're able to tell, and the depths, especially, that you can get to, and really just like how far you can kind of push the things we're talking about, like relationships and sort of the inner struggle of people. Like you guys, we're talking about that Frank Miller run, and I think that was more than 12 issues, I think, wasn't it? That Frank Miller run on Daredevil.
Yeah, several. I mean, he's got several trades bound together from his run. Yeah.
And I think that's like even if referencing those kinds of things that gave you an emotional impact in comics, mainstream comics, it's those longer form stories that really fit the bill. Secret Wars was for me. Like, I love Secret Wars. It was so silly, but That was the first like crossover event that really grabbed me, and I'll just never forget that. Like the Beyonder was so crazy, and the battles were so crazy, and I was rooting for Doctor Doom in that last issue. It was just epic.
That's cool. I had like 1 or 2 Secret Wars comics, but I never read them. But I'd love to read them. Read, the full thing of a lot of these classic stories. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's all definitely interesting. And let's see. I'm trying to think of what about as far as the writing and stuff. Like, I wonder, like I just wonder, like, sometimes I wonder if people who write for comics, and I'm sure some do and some don't, but sometimes I wonder if people who write for comics, sometimes do they even study, writing, like how to write, 'Cause, like,
I think they
some
do.
of obviously, like, we're citing a lot of books that are like really good, writing, Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Grant Morris and things like that.
Hmm.
But there's definitely been some some stories where I'm like, you know, there's a little more to writing comics or writing any story than the Marvel method.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And Stan Lee actually made a great contribution as far as writing goes to comics, but you know he was a writer before he even started writing comics, so like that's coming from a different place, but I
Yeah.
don't know, what do you guys think about the writing of comics? Do you think maybe we should up our game here?
I think it's a complicated medium because there
Yeah.
is no standard for how to do it.
Yeah.
And so you've got a multitude of different combinations that all produce the same thing, a comic book. And
Mhm.
and it reads very differently depending on, what combination produced it. You might have a writer who's used to the plot first method, the Marvel method, working with a penciler who isn't, and that can produce something that feels maybe strange and uncomfortable compared to if they had that synergy there. Whereas like when you read, regular regular book, you have one author, one voice, and maybe an editor that made sure that everything was spelled correctly and formatted correctly and all that. It's very different. So you get a lot more. It's a lot purer kind of experience reading a book compared to a comic in most cases, unless you get those little all-star teams that work really well together, and then it produces something very beautiful that reads very well. The story is told at the right pacing and is told properly,
Mhm.
enough character build up and all that. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with how the industry works. You see a lot of indie comics are they're not produced by people that are forced to work together most of the time. Most of the time it's people want to work together, or they spend time curating who they're going to hire or who they're going to pair up with to make a book. Whereas in the mainstream, they have to get a book out. And so sometimes they have to rely on the fill-in penciler or the fill-in inker, or they have to team somebody up to try something, and it doesn't quite work. It's a little bit more like a band than it is like what you would typically have for like producing a book. There has to be a synergy there, and sometimes the synergy goes away over time too. I
Mm.
compare it more to making music than
Yeah.
actually writing.
Yeah. And indie comics are like garage bands,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And and like me and Matu, we're trying to fumble our way through this whole experience because when you look at a comic book, it's words and pictures. If you can tell a story sequentially, you can make a comic book. But what you're describing is, and how strange it is and how difficult it is so real to me right now while I'm in the middle of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we will say what we want to do, and then you go to the page to do it and you realize that you have infinite possibilities
Yeah.
of how you can do it.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly struggling with like, well, what's the best way to do it? How can we best relay this idea? How can we best show this person doing this, or how can we best show this emotion?
Yeah.
And it's and what it comes down to with the writing is that the writing is really visual. If you're a good visual writer, then you'll do well in comics. If you're a very descriptive long form writer, you probably won't do so well. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but what it seems like for us is Macho just he knows what he wants to do, and we talk about it, and we kind of make music together, like you're describing. We make this page together. We talk about what we want it to feel like and do, and then we just kind of like work through the process. And eventually, there's pictures that I've drawn, and there's words that he's written, and they all kind of go together.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, when it works.
Yeah,
when it works.
That's so oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is about the writing, and you were just talking about how sometimes you'll have an idea and you go to execute it, and suddenly it's like, oh, maybe this won't work, or maybe it can work a million ways, you know?
Yeah.
I run into that a lot with, page turns. Page turns are so valuable for, creating that kind of pacing that we were talking about earlier on, where, it has that emotional impact. And when writing for a comic, especially if you're dead set on keeping it to a certain page count, that can be so grueling to get that just right. Like you might have a scene that's only really worth 2 pages, but now you need 3 because you want the page turn for that last panel or something like that. So there's some difficulties, and I think a lot of times maybe a comic doesn't read as well as it could because there have to be compromises and sacrifices sometimes, unless you're making a graphic novel. If you're setting out, I'm going to make a long form thing, I don't care how many pages it is, then you've got the luxury of, you can do a whole damn splash if you want to of that panel and have no consequences on the rest of the story. So I've actually been looking into some other sources that I normally wouldn't for inspiration, like older comics and comics graphic novels created by people that came from different backgrounds or came from one in particular, so that I'm not being so vague, is what was it called? I think it's called like Madame Blaze, something Blaze, but it's like a femme fatale comic. I'm working on a femme fatale comic, that's why I keep referencing these things. But this comic artist and writer, it was a team. They created this short little strip for a pretty long period of time, and it was kind of like a Dick Tracy sort of thing. It showed up in the Sunday paper in the UK, and at some point it became so popular they wanted to create a graphic novel, and the only way that the guy knew to work was in that strip format. And he was used to, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, boom. He didn't deal in pages. So when he went to go and write the script for this graphic novel that they were doing, he made no indication of pages whatsoever. It was literally just panel 1, panel 2, all the way through. And it was like, I think the comic itself ended up being, it was like 40 some pages or something like that. And you get to the end of the script and he's still going panel 198, panel 199, panel 200. And I was thinking, wow, what a freeing way to approach making a comic, a long form comic, not thinking in pages, just thinking in those moments and those beats, and then leaving it up to the penciler to construct that and orchestrate how that's all supposed to play out. Because if you're not concerned about page count, the comics medium can be one of the best mediums ever. But if you're forced to work within a format and you're not seasoned like some of those people are, it can be really tough. And I think it could affect the outcome a real lot.
Yeah, I'm a print guy. I love print. I love the smell of it. I love printed comics. Digital comics, digital long form comics are definitely have that freedom that you're describing. But I love the constraints of working within print and knowing that the press sheet is going to give me 16 pages, and so I've got to do my math. So 48 pages is a comic I can afford to create, or I can get funded probably. So having like that constraint set on you, I think it does help you. Like a lot of, well, not everybody, but a lot of creative people will just keep indulging themselves. You know what I mean? Like they'll just continue to indulge themselves over and over again. And what happens is not going to be sometimes commercially successful because of either the time it takes to do it or the amount of different places that they push, right? But for me, it just helps to know that I have 48 pages. That's my box,
Right.
And within that box, I can do whatever I want to, but within that box.
Right.
So I kind of have some boundaries that help me. And I know that if I've got to get through this scene, and like you're talking about those page turns, like if I want to have a dramatic page turn when they go to the next page, then I've got to figure that out. And it is maddening and frustrating, but at the same time, it does give you kind of constraints that sort of add to the art form that you're making.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree. Just to be clear about the panels and stuff that I was mentioning just now, it's not for everybody, obviously, but I think you could still apply that to something like a 22-page comic or a 48-page comic, but then the onus is put on the penciler to decide what makes that issue. You know, what gets into that issue versus the next issue, that kind of thing.
Yeah. No doubt. And I think I like both. I actually like working both ways. It's hard to say. I really enjoy limitations. And trying like the challenge of it. But at the same time, there is certain projects where I'm like, I don't want to know what the page count is. I just want to make the best story I possibly can while I'm writing it.
Yeah.
And then we'll figure out the pages later, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely a strength, I think, to both things.
I'm kind of going through that right now with my my comic Sisyphean Complex. I'm writing it in a way. I have the outline of the entire series. I know where the story is going. I know pretty much every last little thing that's happening. But the way that I'm approaching actually putting it out is I'm working on one issue at a time. I'm not writing everything, you know, to the letter all at once. I'm working on one issue at a time and I'm letting it evolve. So I have like my outline that's sort of like my rails. If I need to get back on the path, I can get there, but I'm allowing each issue to kind of dictate where the story is going to go and what little chunk I can tell in that moment. And it's been interesting because I've never worked quite that way. I'm usually like I need to finish the whole thing person, and that usually keeps me from finishing anything. So
Yeah,
I much prefer working on shorter things that I can finish.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm like that too. If I try to have the whole thing figured out before I start, I'll never start.
yeah.
And so I generally jump in, and either that's a good thing or a bad thing. You know, like when you just jump in the deep end, so to speak, in a story, you just start doing it. And I do that, and sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't.
It's kind of fun though, trying to figure things out like that. Like you might make a mistake in issue 1 that you need to correct, you know, a few issues later, and it's exciting.
Yeah,
That's kind of how a lot of comics work too. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
No doubt.
Hey, I'm sorry, but I need to jump because I got to get the kids lunch.
Nope, totally cool.
Right
That's
on.
all.
I appreciate you having me on very much, Martian. I definitely want to jump on again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, and have a great day, man.
Yeah, it's
Mike,
good meeting you, man.
yeah, nice to meet you too. Great conversation. I'm definitely going to be following you.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Yeah, same here.
All right, later.
Take care.
Later, man. Yeah, I guess that's a good break. I had definitely some other things that I think can go well, but I kind of forgot about the chat. Sorry, guys. I can't help it. Like I got into the conversation, I guess. But Clay, also known as Van Illustrations, was saying some things. He said, film has been studied so heavily that techniques have evolved that heighten audience immersion. Comics have been around even longer, but it's more free form. So there's many more possibilities. So there isn't these rules for telling a good story with comics. Have I been emotionally affected by a comic? Not a whole lot, but the stories are still valuable in a very unique way.
That is very true. Very, very true. Coming from a film background, I can say that a lot of the writing and directing it can be very formulaic at times, even though it's you have some kind of unique qualities to different films and television shows. There are definitely systems at play, and the people that do the best know those systems and can work very quickly because of them. So yeah, that's a really good point. I think the closest thing comics has to that is Wally Wood's 22 panels. Other than that, you're on your own.
I wonder if we can expand those 22 panels, because I feel like, because I love those. Like, I go to those when I need them, and I'd love to see some more.
I think we could. I think in the modern age, people have created some new stuff. Maybe not quite panels, but I think there are some nifty little things that work that I've seen repeated in more modern comics. Like, for example, like the little brief introductions are becoming more popular. Like maybe 3 to 5 pages of story before the splash page. That's something that's become very common. Like a little interlude, I guess. That's pretty cool. Or like the full page. I learned actually that it's not called a splash when you just do a full page of art. It's just like a large panel. It's just that's it. A lot of people refer to it as a splash, but the splash has like the copy on it of like the writer and the penciler and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
But anyways, those full page images, those are becoming pretty popular too. Like to end a chapter or stuff like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you could expand on Wally's panels.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I could also think of like, just like how sometimes people use very small panels repetitively, and it does some interesting things with time and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I recently did this actually on this page right here. I stole Todd McFarlane's usage of the very long close-up panel,
Oh, cool.
which, that was being done a lot in the 90s, especially by McFarlane and Liefeld and stuff. And I don't know, it's something, it's a fun, different way to slice up an image and stuff. And I think there's something, you can kind of, it's like one of those things like with the Wally Wood stuff where you can be like, I don't know what I'm going to do here. Maybe I can, just do this kind of panel.
Yeah. I've started. I've had that sheet for a long. I printed it out actually and put it in. I have like a little file folder of helpful comic stuff. But I just recently started looking at it. I think I was talking to Teresa one day about how I need to start looking at it more because it is.
It's nice when you get stuck, you can just pull it out and be like, oh yeah, I could use that kind of panel.
Yeah. Don't know what to do here. Silhouette, perfect.
Oh yeah, I wanted to finish up here with the chat. Let's see. Daniel Liebar Art. Sorry, dude. He says, my dad and I use a very similar method to Marvel method for our webcomic. That's cool. I mean, I love the Marvel method. I've pretty much, that's what I've done, through a lot of my comics, my mini comics especially, and just pretty much everything up until what I'm writing now. Right now I'm using a much different method. And it's either a Marvel method or it's like literally just creating a bulleted list and then going from there and starting on pages and stuff. And there's something really freeing about the fact that you can write that way in a comic, especially if you're the artist and writer,
Yeah, I think as long as you have a clear idea of where your beginning, middle, and end, you can do a lot. You can really fill out a lot just from those basic little skeleton structure.
Yeah, no doubt. Let's see, Teresa. I've been dipping my toes into writing a bit more lately, and it's hard to make it flow, even if you have a method making it interesting, coherent, and elegant. I guess it just takes practice like drawing.
Yeah.
She says. Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say writing is it's an art of its own, definitely, and any form of art of writing. I mean, when you start doing it with comics and adding pictures, it adds on a whole new layer of complication, like kind of like we were talking about earlier. And I think it does take time. It think it takes a long time. I've heard people say that like it takes 200 pages or something of comics before you actually know what you're doing, and I kind of agree. I don't think I even have like I've had this discussion with some people before that have attributed more pages to my count than I would. I think as far as like my page count, I'm very, very early on. I have a lot to learn still. I think I could agree with that assessment of the 200 pages. I feel like every page I do, I learn something new.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, comics. I mean, it's just there's just so much to comics, but then also it's the same with writing stories, like Teresa's saying. Like, a few years ago, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago at this point, I went on basically what I'm finding now is a journey, but at first I thought it was like, oh, I'm gonna read this book and figure it out or something. Like,
Uh-huh.
trying to figure out what story is, like what
Yeah,
is story, how do stories work? Because the same thing, I always have been thinking about this with comics. It's like I want to know how stories work so I can make better stories. Because I mean, obviously judging on, old like McFarlane and Liefeld comics isn't the best when you're talking about writing, but I was dissatisfied with that. Just put it that way, as far as writing, and I wanted to make comics that actually told a great story, but also had really cool, flashy art and stuff like that. So I wanted to learn about story. So I went on the journey. I started reading books about it, and what I came to find out was this was not something I was going to be able to buckle down and figure out, even if I spent like a couple months. This was something that it's a process to learn how story works. And I'm finally getting to a point where I'm starting to wrap my head around it. But still, I think it's one of those things that I'm going to be learning till I die.
yeah. It's one of those you have to like learn by doing. That's really
Yeah,
like, especially with story, and not just learn by doing, but learn by doing it and then having people read it and give you feedback and stuff too. You know?
absolutely. I think that's huge. I mean, people say it all the time, you have to just do it to learn it. But
Yeah,
man, it's just so true. Like I'm learning so much, and it's because I've been making comics so much more, and I've been actually trying to write so
yeah,
much more.
yeah. That's an area where I feel very fortunate because early on I really got into writing a lot, and so I was able to share my stories with my friends when I was younger. But then getting into theater, honestly, was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me because we were constantly producing different skits, and I had the chance to write a few different plays and constantly testing that material in front of an audience essentially and getting feedback, and then I joined the speech team too, and that was a similar thing where you're creating content and presenting it to people. It's all story, whether you're I had to do a speech thing that sold a product one time, but if you dive into marketing, it's about telling a story about how this product is going to enhance your life. It's foreshadowing essentially. But that feedback is my point of it all, is that feedback is so crucial. I think in addition to making comics, even if you could get involved in something like a short story group or something like that could help too, because then you get that more immediate feedback. Because comics, you have to draw them too, and
Yeah.
that tacks on a lot of extra time for sure. Mitchell actually just pointed out his introduction to storytelling was through tabletop RPGs. That's another great point. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons with my friends all the time. I was always the DM because I loved telling stories. I cared
Mm,
a lot less about the game than I did about like, oh, they're gonna love this. And
yeah.
that's another great place to test that out. That's actually a really great example. And that's something that's interactive too. So you're getting real-time feedback. They're not just reading something or experiencing something and then telling you how they think about it. They're playing into it as well, and if
Right.
they're excited, then it's good, and if they're not, then maybe it needs some work. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's all kinds of ways to sharpen that skill. Another thing that I used to do was oh, I still do, I just have it all packed up now, is I have these little jars of a plot and a uh, a genre, and I think it was a location. Um, I have all these strips of papers that just have just as many as I can think of. Sometimes if I'm bored, I'll just write down new ones to toss in the jar. And if I'm ever feeling like practicing, I'll just shake them up and, toss them out and then try to write a story, a short story, like a synopsis about that. Like what is that story? Can I make that work? Stuff like that can be helpful too. Just for what I'm getting at is just to iron out those kinks of figuring out what story is to you, because I think that's the biggest question. Some people think it's character driven. I personally think it has a little bit more layers than that. I think it can be plot driven. I think that plot can be driven by a character, but the intrigue doesn't necessarily have to be about that character. There's also like more intricacies too. Like there's a difference between like a main character and a protagonist. You can have a main character who's not the protagonist, and vice versa. So it's similar to like there are some, I guess, loose rules in terms of structure, but even people like, Tarantino and I can't remember the guy who did Memento, but it's been proven that you don't even need to tell your story beginning, middle to end either, so even the most basic rules can be broken. You start talking about story and I can ramble all day, so I'm just going to stop right there. I feel like it was like a tick or something.
Yeah, no, it's one of those topics for sure. And I'll just say, like, I don't know, I'm really enjoying it, learning about it. I'm finally enjoying it because before it was more of a struggle. But I do think that some of these, something that I think that people shy away from sometimes. I mean, there's obviously, if you follow like this whole, try to learn about story stuff, you're going to come to find out very quickly that people talk about there's a difference between a pantser and a plotter.
Yeah.
And what I'm realizing is, to me, I think whether either of those two types know it or not, and some of them do, they both do both of those things.
Yeah.
I don't think you can really get away from story structure, and I don't think you can really get away from also just kind of going by the seat of your pants and writing,
Yeah, at some point you have to do one or the other, no matter what you do. Even if you have this meticulous outline plotted out, I mean, you have to just sit down at a blank page at some point, right? And just figure out what that sentence is, like how you're gonna expand that into a scene. Like, yeah. I agree.
Yeah, at some point you got to write it, and you can't sit there and try to write something and also try to think about all the different plot elements in your mind while you're trying to write. You just have to write, or else, like I've tried that. The same thing with comics. I can't think about all the rules and how to, in understanding how to make comics by Scott McCloud or something. Like, I can't think of all those rules while I'm sitting down to make a comic. I just have to sit down and make the comic, and then kind of reevaluate later.
Yeah. I don't know who I read a quote recently from, oh man, it's killing me that I can't remember. I want to say it was somebody like Frazetta. It was one of the bigger names. They said something along the lines of it was great to finally get to the point where I could take everything that I'd learned and throw it out and just be free to create. It was something along those lines, and I just, oh man, it washed over me like an epiphany. Like, yes, I can't wait for that moment, because and I guess you could have that moment in little doses too. Maybe not like a mastery type moment, but a moment where you decide, you know what, I've been reading about this shit long enough. I think I got a good handle on it. I'm past the true beginner stage. I now have some knowledge. Let me just fucking do this thing. Instead of sitting on it and trying to figure out the best way. Because man, I'll tell you, like that's always the mindset that I'm in when I actually finally make progress. And I make mistakes, but it feels better to make those mistakes and fix them than it does to be stuck wondering how to even start making anything in the first place. That's the worst place to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing, is a lot of that stuff, it's it's almost like that stuff is good. You have to know it. It's good to have it in the back of your mind.
Mhm.
But then you have to write, and then after you write, you can use it as a troubleshooting tool,
Yeah.
and go back, and that's when, they say editing is where the writing happens. So that's when you take those things out.
Yeah, I think it was possibly Stephen King. Maybe it was Robert McKee. One of them that wrote a book suggested to just write, like just write. Don't worry about structure. Put all that aside and just write. You and the typewriter, which obviously dates it, but and then if something doesn't work, that's when it's time to pull out your toolkit and fix it. I think about it kind of like with art too, like you want to get to the point where you can freehand most of this stuff or eyeball most of this stuff. But when something looks off, you know how to fix it. You know the quote unquote proper way to construct it. You want to hopefully get to a point where you don't have to rely on that stuff, but it's there when you need it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is though, kind of relating to the topic here too, is it's true. You can't try to be perfect with it, and you have to just do it. But also, being a comic book artist, or creator, you can't just ignore the fact that there has been a lot of understanding that has been and study that has gone on about writing.
Oh
And
yeah.
you can't just kind of ignore that and be like, I'm just, I don't need to because I'm making pictures, like I don't need to I don't
Yeah.
need to worry about like story structure and stuff. No, like please, people like who make comics,
Yeah.
look into that, learn that stuff. You throw it away after, but at least get it in your mind because it's gonna help you, I think, make better stories.
Man, I totally agree. I see that more, especially with humor comics these days. I'm a member of a lot of humor comic groups on Facebook, and it's like, I don't know, they missed the lesson somewhere. Like there's a setup and then a punchline, not just a punchline or not just a setup. Like you got to know those basic things, at least like have them in the back of your mind to be able to make the best stuff that you can make. That's what it's really all about. It's like that old saying, learn the rules before you break them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't let it stop you, but at the same time, don't not look into it.
Yeah. I mean, it can only help. You don't have to agree with everyone's kind of philosophies on how these things work to get something from them. Even if it's just the fact that maybe you disagree, but at least like give it the time to learn it and hear that particular source out and give it a shot. That's like I kind of related to art again. A lot of people ask what the best book is and stuff to learn how to start drawing and stuff. And I always say the same thing, like just pick one. Like if you literally know nothing, just pick one and give it the time of day. Go through every page, draw every drawing that's in it, really learn what that method has to offer. And in the end, you're gonna come out of it a better artist.
Yep.
And if you feel uncomfortable with the method that you learned, or you feel like there's got to be an easier way or a better way, pick another book and try that. It's different for everybody, and I feel like it's the same for writing too. Like maybe the Robert McKee books are gonna spark a light bulb in your head, and you're gonna suddenly get it. Maybe the Stephen King book is the one that's gonna do it. That's a little bit more loose and seat of the pants. Maybe it's the Alan Moore on writing. It's even shorter, and maybe you really just need some words of encouragement to get started. Maybe it's the Grant Morrison book. I mean, there's tons of different books on writing. I always say just pick one, and you're gonna come out a better writer at the end of it anyway. So
Another version of that answer would be all of them.
yeah, or all of them.
Like just try them all out. Like I mean, I love when I talk about writing, especially for comics and stuff, I always talk about my buddy Foy Storm because he's got a lot of experience writing, not just comics but also comics. So like and he's learned a lot of these things. He's gone through a lot of these books, and he still is reading like almost every book he can get his hands on. And you know, a lot of the stuff he's already read, already heard, you know, a million times, but you know, there's always that one little like new thing that might like help you do your stories better, you know, and if you have the opportunity or the time, like, yeah, why not? Why stop learning, you know?
Absolutely. I try to keep that's like my main collection is like um, fascinating how-to books. I love the DC Comics guides. I got the Marvel ones. I've got a handful of other like I wouldn't consider them zines, but they're very small. They're definitely not like a book, but they're sort of instructional, like back matter that was released in other comic issues, maybe that they've compiled into a book, things like that. All of
Mhm.
that's so helpful. I've still got some of my old books from college too, from different writing classes and whatnot, like style manuals and everything. Because you know, you can't, your brain only holds so much, and beyond that, memory is very inconsistent. So it helps to go back to that stuff. And if you ever feel like you know everything, just pick up a book you've read before, and you probably see something you forgot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, to be honest, when I check out an art book or something, I mean, I pretty much just skim it anyways, and I use it as reference when I need something. Then I'll go like look deep into that chapter or whatever.
Yeah,
Um, but I mean, everybody, that's not everybody, you know, some people will read it from back to front, but I'll be honest, like, say, like you know, the McLeod books, like, I've tried to read those a few times and I'm just like,
really.
it's too dense, you know, to take it all in, really.
I have read them a few times each, but in very specific points in my life. I think when I was ready to, because they are dense. That's some seriously dense material there. But I feel like a lot of it. I think it's really great material for people who need an introduction to comics or want to be presented with like a different way of thinking about them.
Yeah.
But I honestly can't recall any time that I've gone to make a comic and then pulled something from one of those books, because I
Mm,
think it's a lot more philosophical than anything else. It's definitely not like a how-to. It leaves you with more questions than answers, for sure.
mm, interesting.
I think especially making comics, because it's like chapter 2, inking. Here's 50 million ways that people ink. Oh, great.
Yeah, it almost gives you too much choice.
Yeah. Which is cool because I gotta say, like the Scott McCloud books, that was one of the first books that I ever got about seriously making comics. And I got it when I was a kid. I don't know exactly when it came out, but I want to say I was in like fourth or fifth grade when I got my copy. And like that just busted the doors open for me and really helped me get started making comics and not caring about how. I think that was one of the most important things I learned from the Scott McCloud book is like, hey, yeah, there's a lot of mainstream comics that you read. I'm sure you're familiar with Batman and Spider-Man and all these things, but there's also these things called indie comics and underground comics that do things differently and don't adhere to the same kind of standards and stuff. And I was like, what? So I started making comics on notebook paper with crayons and watercolors and you name it. Like it was a very freeing experience. So like not having any knowledge of that at all, I don't think I would have even started making comics. So I would
Interesting.
definitely recommend that one as an early read for sure.
Hmm, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm all about story these days. I'm doing a lot of writing and really excited about it. I think I'm going to be doing some videos specifically on some of the things I've learned.
Cool.
You know, kind of on a beginner level because I do feel I'm still very much a beginner writer. But you know, I think I've come across a few different methods, especially in the early stages of writing a story, that I think might be helpful, especially for comic creators, because especially for comic artists, because you know it's kind of easy to get all into like the storytelling or just the regular drawing aspect of comic art, and
Yeah.
but then trying to become a writer, you know, it's hard to, first of all, convince yourself that you can also write comics, but then second of all, like, to just wrap your head around what it really means to write a story, you know, and how to approach it. And it seems really intimidating. And there's a couple methods that I found that I think can make it a little less intimidating. And I'm definitely looking forward to sharing those as soon as I can.
Cool. I'll definitely be looking forward to that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's all that, you know, super mind blowing, but you know, it might be something normal to somebody who's written a lot of stuff. But for me, it was like, man, if it was explained to me this way, I feel like I would have been able to approach it quicker, you know. So
Yeah. Sometimes those insights can make all the difference, man. Like I'm having I wouldn't say like a hard time. I'm having some difficulties, some challenges writing this comic that I'm working on now, because for the first time I'm actually trying to conform to a specific page count, but it's led to some really interesting developments actually. Like I felt I've had some moments where I've kind of freed myself by adding a little more restriction. And then I've also had moments where I've changed the story a little bit because of what I could fit in an issue versus what I couldn't fit in an issue. And like deciding if I really wanted to leave it there or if doing it this other way would actually, you know, make it more of an impact, more of an impactful ending and more of a, you know, a good send off into the next issue. And dealing with stuff like that has been very new to me. I've always been a very like I'm either doing a very very short thing. I feel like I'm better at writing short stories, to be honest. I think that's where most of my experience lies, and is doing very short things. But this is a longer story that I'm breaking up into chunks and really wanting that issue by issue experience. It's obviously it's its own whole story that I want to bind together into one book eventually, but I really want that episodic kind of feeling to it, which I've never done before. I've never done anything that's been episodic. It's always been a one and done kind of thing for me. So that's been challenging. It's been really challenging.
yeah, it does seem like it's a different beast. I feel like you have to kind of there's a lot of different approaches to it because I see like TV shows and stuff, and I see them doing different approaches, and it seems like the way, maybe a good way to go about it, especially if it's going to be like an ongoing episodic thing, is you know, you almost create like a story engine. So it's like this big kind of way that it kind of works. You might have an ending in mind, but in between that, you can do a lot of different things. And I don't know, so it's like this is kind of the mode they're in. It's almost like they're in the second act for like most of the story, and then eventually you'll go to the third act or something.
Yeah. That's why some shows seem to feel like they end abruptly, because they've kind of had it planned for a long time, but they've been fortunate enough to keep getting renewed for another season for, you know, so many years.
Yeah. And another approach for episodic stuff too that I think is really interesting. I see this with Grey's Anatomy. I think is actually a really well written show. Outside of the weird, sometimes the politic injecting stuff bothers me of all shows. But other than that, like what they do a lot of times is they'll have like a theme in each episode, and they'll kind of, there's a couple things they do. Sometimes they'll have a theme, and many of the characters will experience that same theme in a different way, which is interesting. And then if they don't do that, it'll be like a lot of shows will do this, where it's like they have a cast of characters. You know that it's kind of about this one character specifically, but the cast is really a big part of it as well. So in any given episode or any string of episodes, it'll be more about one character than the other characters, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which I think is interesting.
See, and that's kind of all the stuff that I've been excited to do with this, because I like that kind of stuff, and I especially like episodic storytelling where each episode is sort of its own story as well. Like if you really wanted the whole story to get everything. You'd have to watch every single episode. But I like the ones where you can just jump in and watch a single episode and think, oh, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I get it. There was a definitive beginning, middle, and end, and everything that I experienced was resolved. And maybe I'd like to know a little more about this character or that character. I like those things where they kind of encapsulate the story into little digestible chunks that just sort of add up over time without needing like the context of the previous episodes. I really like that sort of style.
Do you have like an example of that? Because that seems like almost like having your cake and eating it too, like trying to do two things at once,
Let me see. I think classic Doctor Who used to be like that. Not so much the current Doctor Who. The current Doctor Who's become much more like a traditional episodic show where it builds upon previous episodes. But classic Doctor Who, there was an arc, and there was plenty to learn about the Doctor and all the different companions, and there were some subtle callbacks within the episodes. But overall, you could watch like a short arc. You could watch like, I think they were like 2 to 3 episodes would be like a complete arc, and you'd get it. You'd get the totality of the show because the arc always started with them appearing in the police box in a new land, and going off on an adventure that was just starting right then and there, perhaps developing as characters in some way, shape, or form, but you didn't need the context of previous episodes to understand that transition. I think, yeah, so classic Doctor Who comes to mind. Even shows like Quantum Leap come to mind. There's an arc to that, but each episode deals with a completely new situation. Even shows like, the more I think about it, it's kind of a bygone era. I think shows now do it a lot less than shows even in like the 90s and prior. Walker Texas Ranger. there's an arc to that. There's character development to all those different characters. Some of them have struggles that you learn about throughout the seasons, but each episode there's a particular thing going on that needs to be solved and butts need to be kicked, and you could watch one episode and get it, but if you watched more you'd get more out of it. Does that make sense? I like that stuff a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because it actually I think relates a lot to comics, and sometimes I wonder if we need to go back to that a little bit because that to me is kind of how episodic comics were done, in the older times,
Oh yeah.
I mean, every I just read the first 2 stories of Stranger Tales where Iron Man was first introduced, and
Cool.
in each story they tell the whole Iron Man story, but it's a new Iron Man story.
Oh, nice. Yeah, see, I kind of agree, actually. I don't think we need to replace everything that's going on now because there's some cool stuff, but I would love to see some more of that classic storytelling. I remember as a kid, you could pick up just about any issue and get enough out of it to understand who the characters were and what was happening. There seemed to be like an evolution at some point where, especially now, like you cannot pick up a single issue of any mainstream comic that I'm aware of, and I admit there's a lot more than I've read, so I'm sure there's counter examples, but in my experience, I can't pick up a single issue and feel satisfied. Like, oh, cool, that was a good story. I can't wait to read more, but I feel like more times than not, I pick up an issue and I'm like, okay, I can't wait to read the rest of this story.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would love to just go into a comic store and not have to worry about having to get issue 1 through whatever or like a certain arc. Like, I would love to be able to just pick up a Batman comic and be like, okay, I get to go home and read a cool Batman story.
Yeah,
like, that would be awesome.
yeah. Well, I feel like we don't have that as much anymore. I gotta say, I'm definitely going to be guilty of the more modern approach, I think, with Sisyphean Complex, but I'm trying very hard to still make the issue interesting and really pack it full of information, for one, that's going to help you understand the story as a whole, but to try to encapsulate at least some minor arc. We start somewhere, we end somewhere, and we have a total experience. But because of the nature of the story that I'm telling with this comic, there's a lot of overarching. It just is. The comic has a lot to do with memory, and so each issue is definitely going to be drawing upon things that have happened in previous issues. But again, because it's having to do with memory, that's also kind of helping me chunk it out into separate experiences as well. So I don't know. It's very largely experimental, and that's why I'm taking so long to really fine tune the writing before I start cranking out pages on it.
Well, I mean, like you said, none of these, methods, are the only way you can do it. So it's, there's no reason why you have to do it the way we're both saying. Oh, it'd be nice, but I guess it would. That's just like, a wish, but at the same time, it it would be kind of sad to see longer form storytelling go as well. I mean, I want to read an epic Lord of the Rings. I want to be able to read like a Lord of the Rings style story in comics,
Yeah.
but I also want to be able to pick up an issue and read a whole story and enjoy it just for that.
Yeah. That's actually, you bring up a good point with Lord of the Rings, actually, because just since we're talking about writing and we're talking about, comics being a particular form and this and that being a different form and what's the best form and all that, there have been a lot of adaptations done in comics. Like you could read Don Quixote, you could read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in comic form. Somebody did I believe they did Dante's Inferno. Maybe it was the Odyssey. Maybe I'm getting them mixed up. But there's people that have done retellings of classic literature in comic form, and I gotta say, it can be done. Like Don Quixote was extremely enjoyable, and I think in a way maybe more enjoyable because the story itself and the humor just lends itself so well to the comics medium. And the people that did that comic definitely have some comic strip sensibilities. So it was awesome. I got more out of the comic version than I did out of the actual work.
Interesting.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, on the other hand, if you've never experienced Lord of the Rings and want to in a very brief format, the comics format is the best because they do compression like you wouldn't believe. They squeeze that story in, so and you get everything. They don't really leave out much at all. So, but yeah, that's another compression is like that's a whole other topic that you could probably do a whole other podcast on because that's something that you can do in comics that I think works a little bit better than in film. I think when you compress things too much in film, it starts feeling very rapid. Whereas like in comics, going back to the control of the timing, it's up to the reader at what pace that they're reading, like I think about old EC comics used to have, sometimes they would change scenes from panel to panel, in one panel you would hear about somebody drinking some kind of potion, and then in the next panel they're at some dinner party and their stomach's upset, and then the next panel they're turned into a monster. So, but it's up to the reader how quickly those things happen. And
that story compression is an interesting topic. I actually hadn't really heard much about that until recently. My buddy Storm actually brought it up to me, and he's like, "There's this whole thing about story compression." I'm like, "Oh, okay, I didn't really even know about that."
Yeah, that's something I discovered recently too, actually. There's not a whole lot of information about it that I've been able to find in terms of like using it, just that it exists.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I don't know. I still don't know too much about it. Ronnie Gunter says, in college, I was in directing class, then did a lot of acting and singing in musicals in the past on stage. It helps you understand keeping character, which you can apply to making your characters. They're actually talking about that, like keeping, Teresa was saying that too. I have trouble making my characters act in distinct ways and keeping them in character. And that is something. Do you have any thoughts on kind of that and that type of thing?
Oh man, I have a weird relationship with my characters. I kind of always have. So I don't know if I have any advice other than to just be kind of insane and let them just live in your head.
Yeah.
For me, when I'm creating characters, I don't know. Maybe it's because I was an only child and was left alone a lot, but I used to kind of imagine like my characters talking. So a lot of times before I've even gotten to the point where I'm like truly writing, this is making me sound insane. I don't know if I should be talking about this, but whatever. We've already started. Um, I get this sense of like the characters are already sort of coming up with their own personalities, you know, and because I do have a bit of like a theater background, I will kind of like act out some of their mannerisms, and especially when I'm like trying to figure out how they're moving about in a scene, like if I'm writing or if I'm drawing, like all the goblins from my goblin comic, I like really acted out what they were doing. I took a lot of reference photos of myself, like getting into their headspace to make sure that I got the right expressions and stuff, which those videos will never be released. They're fucking crazy, but I think it really helps. Like
In full costume.
no. But I think the way to kind of distill that down is to like just really get to know them, like give them distinct personalities. If you have to base them off of other existing characters or people that you've met, I do that a lot. I'll base them off of people that I've met that are interesting, you know, characters in their own right. And just really try to develop them in a unique way. I think the best way to do that is just think about where they're coming from and what makes them them. You know, what's their background like? I'm not about doing bios and stuff like that. I never really got into that. I don't fill out like what their favorite foods are and things of that nature unless it's absolutely important to the story. I really try to figure things out based on the story. And like if I have to figure out what their favorite food is, I'll figure it out for that scene, you know.
Right.
But just kind of knowing them and where they're coming from and why they're in the story in the first place, I think kind of, at least that's how I approach it. I think that helps me get to know them and it keeps them consistent. I also tend to make very exaggerated personalities, so it's easier for me because of that.
Well, I think there's a key in that too, and this is something that I'm still learning as well. But one thing I actually plan on making a video about this one too eventually. And I'm still just learning, so I don't really have it in my hat yet there. But there's something that Akira Kurosawa said in directing, like when he was directing for things like Seven Samurai and stuff like that. He would tell his actors to pick one gesture and do that, like repeat it, do that all the time. And I thought that was interesting because we think about gesture and drawing, and it's like that is such a huge part of drawing. It's like when I first learned about gesture, like in class, I was like, this is the worst thing ever. Like, I don't want to draw crappy drawings. I don't want to draw like just I want to draw cool drawings. I don't want to just sit here and do this, you know. But now I do tons of gesture drawings, and it's the key to making a character look awesome.
Yeah,
and I think there's something to that with acting, obviously, you know, as Akira Kurosawa was saying, but also, you know, when you're thinking about your characters, you know, I like what you said about, you know, you make exaggerated characters, and I almost feel like, especially with comics, that's actually something you probably should do, you know, because I think Todd McFarlane even said, you know, when you're doing comics, you know, it's not good in movies, but in comics, make sure you're being very melodramatic because it just takes a lot more to bring across an emotion or a feeling or whatever it is that you're trying to bring across, the acting or whatever, you know. So it is, you know, make them almost like a caricature, you know.
Totally. Yeah. I'll go back to goblins. Something that helped with that and that I think can help with the melodrama and kind of creating distinct characters is to literally act them out. Like instead of staying in that blank, soundless space of writing or just drawing, take some of your lines and like actually like think about you're creating a character for the stage versus a comic, and how would you make that unique? Because all you have in that environment is yourself. So how do you make yourself a different character? What differentiates, Bob from Joe if you were to like, walk off stage and walk back on in your same clothes? You don't even have a costume, How does Joe stand compared to Bob? How does Joe talk compared to Bob? Is Joe more aggressive? Is he more passive, dominant or submissive? Does he use more hand gestures? All those kinds of things can make a different character. You look at Deadpool and Spider-Man get confused a lot because they actually have very similar kind of mannerisms and gestures. They have very, they're masculine characters, but they tend to have very effeminate poses. They tend to jut their hips out more if they're standing still, or stick their butts out if they're getting in someone's face or whatever. There's these little things that tip people off to a completely different kind of character and different mannerisms. But even between the two, there's differences as well. Obviously, Spider-Man's a lot more spider-like. He's more slender, he's more youthful. He has a lot more, I think, energetic kind of mannerisms. But things like that. Like with the goblins, for example, I got a really big guy, and he's like, I guess it's kind of cliche, but he's like the big dumb dope like you would find from like the Looney Tunes era, or like Curly from the Three Stooges. And so I tried to play him like a heavy character, and I thought, being so as massive as he is, I wanted everything about him to be a little bit slow and a little bit kind of reserved in a way, so he doesn't have as elaborate as of expressions as, say, someone like Larry, who's like thin as a rail and all spindly and crazy looking. And when I would try to act them out, like I kind of accentuated that. So like I made Larry crazy and like literally just out of his mind. He's like barely paying attention half the time. And for Mo, I wanted him to be more, I named them after the Three Stooges, if you can't tell. For Mo, I made him more of like a staunch, tough guy, general kind of guy. So every statement that he made was almost like an aggressive action, like he's slamming his fist into his palm, or he's like punching the air, or like jamming a finger, like very like, I'm gonna poke you with my words kind of thing. Whereas Larry was very like submissive, but like sneaky, like he wants to get away with anything that he possibly can, but he's very timid and flippant. So a lot of times you'll see Larry with his wrists down and his fingers spread out, very like theatrical and flamboyant. And to me, those are ways that me, like just as a person with no other costuming or accessories or anything, I could portray that to somebody. I could show somebody that body language, and create different characters just being me. So if I could do that just being me, then when I go to draw them, and they're also, drawn differently with the costuming and with the different stylizations and stuff, it's gonna come through even more. That's where that melodrama is just going to explode, and suddenly you've got these three very different personalities. So
absolutely, yeah, I think that's a lot of good stuff. I'm definitely getting a lot from this whole thing with the conversation and characters, and yeah, I think it definitely has a lot to do with exaggerating and stuff. Let's see. Yeah, and I've also not been the type to do, these character sheets and stuff. And I always felt bad. I was like, I'm not doing, the work to really get to know my characters. But I've started to realize that maybe it's just not, it just doesn't resonate with me. I don't really feel like I need to know all that information. And they say, like, when you start doing that, you do like this interview or whatever of your character, and you're surprised of how the character actually comes alive to you and starts answering. And I'm like, I don't get that really. It just, I feel like I'm just making stuff up,
And you could do that too. Like I definitely, I could see the benefit of like the bio page type of thing, but I don't think it's necessary. I think a lot of, and this is just personal opinion, but I think a lot of emphasis gets put on world building and character building and all of this building of things that ultimately end up not being the story. Like I've heard the argument too that like, I think things like Save the Cat and like some of these books that have been written on storytelling have kind of created a monster in the sense that a lot of people feel like that is the definition. And so they look for that whenever they watch a movie or read a book or read a comic these days. But a story can be anything you want it to be, as long as it's got a beginning, middle, and end, and something interesting happens in between, you know? So as long as your characters are helping reach that end, then everything's working fine. You don't need to know what they ate for breakfast. You don't need to know what kind of childhood they had or what their, grand motivations or desires are. They just have to be involved in something interesting. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I approach it. That's how I feel about it, and that's what I think about when I go to write.
Yeah, I think there's something there, and I've been, and we'll start to end it on this because I think we've had a really good discussion, and I think it's at that point. But I think I've been thinking a lot about what are like the main ingredients, like if you have to boil down story to what it truly is. And what I came to realize, actually, Fue Storm told me something. He's like, well, I wouldn't want to say like that there are essential elements, but these elements are important, type of thing. And I think that's true. I think you can't really say, okay, you have to have this to have a story.
Right.
Because once you do that, you're going to have somebody or your own self proving yourself wrong. And I think you're kind of restricting yourself a little bit too much there.
Yeah.
But there are some interesting things. And you brought up the idea of like, there's a beginning, middle, and end. That's like the first thing you hear when you hear anything about writing. And it's true. And it's actually very important, even though it seems like obvious. And it's good to, if you can know the beginning and if you can know the end, those are great ways to kind of hack your story.
Yeah.
You don't need to know the beginning and the end, but if you know those two things, those will help. And then, I think of, when I think of story, what I'm learning and what I think I realize is it's important to like have a struggle, and I think there needs to be an external struggle and an internal struggle. A character wants something, there's a goal, but and then people always say change, and all these things like are kind of ambiguous until you start to study it, and also until you start to try to actually do it, and there's also something, if you guys, you can look in kind of homework if you haven't looked into this, and I know a lot of people have heard about this, but maybe if you're a comic creator, you haven't, because I don't, sometimes comic creators don't necessarily study this specific stuff, but it's very simple. A lot of people have heard of it. The story embryo, Dan Harmon came up with it, or it's also called the story circle. And one thing that's interesting with this is, I don't even fully understand it all. Or before I practiced it, I didn't fully understand it, and I still am learning and understanding it. But there's basically 8 steps, and that kind of bring you from beginning to end of a story. And if you look at that and you just take those bullet points and then try to write a story according to those, just try it. You don't have to. I'm not saying you have to do this to make your story, or you even have to have all these elements in your story, but try taking your story and mapping it across these 8 elements and see if that might help you. It's one way to kind of hack things and maybe even make your story feel a little bit more organized, and if you don't like it, you can throw stuff out. No big deal.
That's interesting. What is that called? Dan Harmon's 8 steps.
It's called the story embryo or the story circle. It basically takes the hero's journey circle and simplifies it into 8 steps.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, and that's the thing, man. It's like whatever helps you write this story, that's the thing you should be using. All of it's there to help. I especially like what you said too about like, use it to fix something or to see if it can help you, fine tune it. Because if your story reads well and people like it, then it works. It's just when it isn't working that you really need to take a look at maybe the problem is structure. It's kind of like even with a good comedy, like stand-up comics will talk all the time about how there's a structure to their show, there's a structure to their joke telling, you know. And sometimes you could tell the same joke, but just in a different order, and suddenly it's hilarious, you know.
That's cool. That's one thing I have never studied, but I know a lot of people talk about, like these comedian podcasts and
Oh
stuff.
yeah,
Talk about the craft of it and stuff.
yeah.
I really want to get into it, but I guess I don't know where to start. But I've heard a lot. You can learn a lot from that.
Man, yeah, studying comedians, I think, are probably the best to learn good storytelling because that's exactly what they're doing. And they're trying to connect a room full of people, sometimes a stadium full of people, to the same story and to get not just a response, but like a roaring reaction from the crowd. That's their goal, you know,
Yeah.
to hit everybody on that visceral level. And if you can learn from them, oh my God, imagine if you could do that with like an emotional scene. If you could create a comic or a movie or whatever where you wanted someone to, you know, cry or gasp or whatever, and the entire, you know, group of people reading it is just like, oh my God. So much so that it's audible, that they have to exclaim it out loud. Because they're good. They're good at setting up those little twists and turns to where you're not expecting what they're going to say. That's really the root of comedy, is you laugh because you weren't expecting what they were going to say. And so I think the same exact thing can be applied to things that aren't funny as well, that are more serious or dramatic or suspenseful.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a condensed version of a story, especially if you're just talking about like just telling one joke. But even like you're saying, like bringing them kind of through a journey, but there's always a surprise. There's always like a setup and a punchline. Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the basic thing of a story.
Totally.
And then also, you know, you can kind of elongate it by putting in some like fun misdirection and stuff, you know. And
Mhm.
yeah, interesting. I definitely want to look into that. Do you have any maybe podcasts or anything that you
And
specifically?
I wish I listen to a lot of them, and I don't know any specific podcast that's like the theme is based on the craft of comedy, but I listen to a lot of like I listen to Tom Segura and his wife on Your Mom's House. That's pretty funny. They interview a lot of comics, and sometimes they get into process. Joe Rogan's podcast, he gets into process quite a bit actually, but it's very few and far between that you get an episode like that. It's mostly the ones that he's talking to other comics for sure. But there's been times where he's been talking to an athlete and he'll relate something to what they're doing to what he does. And suddenly, you know, you've got this plop of wisdom about writing and about writing comedy specifically. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know of a specific comic podcast about the craft of it. Just listen to as many as possible, and they'll drop those little nuggets every once in a while.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Van Illustration, Clay, he's saying this past weekend with Theo Von is killer. I don't know exactly what that is, but I'll do some Googling.
Cool.
And yeah, and Mario asked how's the campaign going. Yeah, it's going pretty good. The Lone Wolf one, it's going really good. Let's see, let's refresh it, see if anybody's done anything since we started the episode. Right now, it's at about 35% of its goal, and I'm refreshing, and my computer is going really slow. But yeah, that's about where it's at, you know. So thanks for asking, and you know, I think we've gone through a lot of really cool stuff about how we can make story better in comics, and really to even some specifics and stuff. And you know, I don't know, the journey is never ending. I think we're all like seeking that and trying to get to that. But I would definitely like to be reading better stories myself and making better stories for sure. So you know, I think it's a worthwhile goal because comics are freaking awesome. You know.
Hell yeah. Toast to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything you wanted to shout out before we leave, Mike?
Just the anthology Kickstarter. That's really the main thing. I guess if any, we don't have it up yet, but it's coming like ridiculously soon. So if you want to keep up with it, I guess, follow Marsh, myself, any of the people in the hundreds. We got our website now, 100daysofmakingcomics.com. If you bookmark that and keep checking in, we should have our site relaunched soon too. That should have all the information about the Kickstarter, the book. We're really putting Robert Johnston. I got to give him all the credit for the website. He stepped up and volunteered to help us out with that, and he's just. I've not been disappointed at all. Like I blink, and he's just done tons of work, and so.
Yeah,
I'm really excited about the new site that's going to get tossed up pretty soon. But
yep, absolutely. And I will say too, I'll put the link in the description. But check out Mike's Instagram and watch all the videos. They are chock full of just interesting nuggets of helpful things to make comics. Like I've learned so much. So
thanks, man.
Definitely check that out.
I have my moments. Thank you.
Yeah, no doubt. Anytime. So other than that, guys, you know where to find me, Marshall Lee _DJP on Instagram and other places, Twitter, all that stuff. DonkeyJawProjects.com. And I think that's going to be it. This is an early bird Artcast that's gone on to 1 p.m. in the Eastern, and it's been a good one. So thanks for watching. Thank you, everybody in the chat. You guys have been awesome, and we will talk to you next time.
Sayonara.
Later.